Hi, I'm Andre from TableTop Jamaica, and we fixed the problem with size categories in TTRPGs. You're welcome. So, I love tabletop role-playing games, but I've always had a problem with size categories. So, when we were designing scales and sizes for our original TTRPG, Duppies and Gunmen, I decided I would try to fix that. I made a really simple and comprehensive size category listing that you're able to use when designing your own tabletop role-playing games, or even just incorporating it into existing systems and adventures just to make your visual descriptors easier. Or even if you don't play TTRPGs, it may be useful for fiction writers. It is possible it may even be useful to the scientific community who sometimes struggle to describe things like meteors or space debris in a way that's easy to imagine for the general public. I call our system the TTRPG Rule of Thumb. And if you want to skip ahead past the preamble straight to the table, you can just click one of the timestamps below to do so. But if you want to go on the full journey, come with me. While you're at it, you can like and subscribe, as here at Tabletop Jamaica, we post TTRPG content pretty regularly. But let's get into what was my issue with size categories in other games in the first place. Being able to picture the proportions of a creature, structure, or item is important to the immersion of role-playing games. If it's not done well enough, it can interrupt your narrative or cause miscommunication in how a player pictures and interacts with an object or creature. You may have to backtrack when somebody's like, "Oh, I thought it was this size," or "Oh, I didn't know it was that big," or "Oh, I thought I could just pick it up." So knowing the size of the object from the jump is pretty useful. Some games stick to the familiar when dealing with size categories to avoid having to list categories in the book at all. Most Ritter, for instance, allows the players to play as mice, so it's easy to use familiar sizes and just imagine them as if you were smaller. So the perspective change, but your familiarity with the object remains the same. If you're playing as a mouse, a cat seems larger, yes, but most people know how big a mouse is compared to a cat, or compared to a rat or squirrel. So they never really have to list creature sizes in books like Mouse Ritter, because it is known innately how these things scale, even if you're imagining yourself from the other end of the scale. For some games, the size category just doesn't matter outside of a narrative flair. For example, in Welcome to Night Vale TTRPG, the stats remain the same. So whether the creature is a fist-sized river rock or a literal 5-headed dragon towering 7 feet, explicitly listing size difference doesn't really matter because the scores and abilities remain the same. So once again, it's not in the book. Similarly, games like Monster of the Week and Cyberpunk would not need to list sizes because really it doesn't matter much. The DM may reduce some skills or some things like HP based on the size of a creature that they present, but those are outliers more than the norm. The reason I needed to list size categories in Duppies and Gunmen were not only for visualization, but because it affected stat blocks. I would be creating flora and fauna and persons and spirits that would inhabit this world. HP, for instance, would be loosely based on how bulky a creature is. Defense also factors in how hard a tiny target would be to hit versus a big one, or how tough and armored a big target might be compared to a small one. Very importantly as well, from a game design perspective, I wanted to create an inverse relationship between strength and stealth, where creatures larger than humans would get higher strength modifiers and lower stealth modifiers on average. And the opposite would happen if the creature was smaller than human, where they'd get lower strength but get better stealth. So games where the size affects the stats. Sizes are mostly mentioned in the book when it actually affects the gameplay experience. When there is some mechanical effects on gameplay. Lancer, a game about space mechs, doesn't get too particular about size, but instead refers to how many spaces on the hexagonal grid your mech will take up, leaving the specific dimensions and the real-world expectations to the imagination of the players. So it matters less if everyone is perceiving the size differently, because everyone is at least on the same page when it comes down to how the mechs scale to each other. Games like Kane have a detailed size system with human size, heavy furniture, large animal, vehicle, large vehicle, building, large building, skyscraper. But human size is the lowest tier, and I need mine to cover smaller creatures. D&D and Pathfinder have a workable system and honestly come the closest to what I would be able to use. They have tiny, small, medium, large, huge, and gargantuan, and dimensions that are specific to each. However, I keep personally having to check if tiny is bigger than small, or if huge is bigger than large, and smaller than gargantuan. And then another issue with using adjectives like this is if I use the word tiny to describe a medium creature, for instance, he is holding a tiny dog. This person is holding a tiny dog. Is it the size category tiny, or is this just a descriptor of the expectations for a dog? Similarly, if I describe a human child as a tiny humanoid, I would be technically right in the descriptive term, but it would be misleading in this game where fairies and pixies exist, and the term tiny humanoid should specifically relate to a humanoid that is tiny, like can't fit in my hand. So now you know where my issues lie. Though it's mostly pedantic, I know. At least I knew what existed already. So I set out to create something more definitive and gave myself a few rules, or you can think of them as goals. My rules, first of all, the most important, non-numeric. It's hard to visualize numbers, so saying the amount of centimeters or the amount of inches something isn't helpful in this case. We already use distance in feet. I didn't want to further complicate it by using things like this thing is 3 feet tall, this is 1 inch tall. No. So non-numeric. 2, variable. I needed these categorizations to cover a range of different sizes. In tabletop roleplay, you just need a general idea of size. It doesn't really have to be that exact. So the differentiation in size between an ant versus a bee, in real life, it's very big. It's a big difference. However, it need not be broken down for the purposes of this particular game. So an ant and a bee will need to be able to fit in the same category. Each category should similarly fit a range of possible instruments. 3, it had to be specific. So this might sound contradictory to the last criteria of being variable, but I promise it isn't, because while the range within the categories may vary, the size categories need to be distinct from one another to prevent confusion, so everyone is on the same general page about the size in question. So calling to mind Kane's example where they have large animal and vehicle. In my visualization, there are many large animals that are about the size of a vehicle. In my size category, I would love if each category was specific to the expectation for the category and they didn't overlap too much. But it also means that whatever is tied to the size category is also specific. So it needs to be generally acceptable that the size is fairly strict. A boulder or stone, for instance, couldn't be size categories. So I couldn't say a boulder size or a stone size as my category, because people have wildly different ideas of what sizes boulders are and should be, and what constitutes a stone versus a boulder. So whatever I'm using needed to be so specific that persons could associate the size with what is being used to describe it without too much overlap. Fourth rule is that the categories needed to be recognizable. So everyone should know what these size categories are from the jump. It should be, for one, well, a hidden rule is that it needed to be nouns or similar to nouns. The adjective or adverb adjective? Wow, I did miss that day at school. The descriptors that Pathfinder and D&D uses are fine, but I would like to tie it to nouns. And those nouns need to be recognizable because it shouldn't break immersion when you have to go search on the internet for whatever the thing is. And then last rule, it needs to be timeless. I was designing Duppies and Gunmen for a modern setting, but I wanted these size categories to be recognizable throughout all aspects of time. So saying something like vehicle sized wouldn't work for my purposes, because what if the campaign is set in pirate days or medieval times? I wanted the characters in the setting to also be able to use the descriptors without it sounding out of place. So if I said something as phone sized in the category, it would definitely break immersion if you're playing in a different period. If a pirate described a bird as phone sized, for instance. I also have that personal rule that I didn't want to use any creature that was in the game as a size category. This was more optional rule. I was willing to break it. It's just that it would be weird for me to say something is mouse sized and also have the stats for a mouse. I moved away from that as much as possible. Okay, so with those rules out of the way, it took a lot of back and forth with my co-writer, who had to be very, very patient with me as I tried to fix a system that technically wasn't broken to make one that was easier for me to envision. I actually don't know yet if anybody else actually would find this useful, but I know it tickles the happy part in my brain when I was finally finished with it. So after a long period of back and forth, well, this breakthrough came after realizing how persons stocked shelves and the categories they use there. So it started with me thinking, what if cup size? But then we didn't end up using that, but that was the basis. What if the smaller size categories were based on how easy it was to carry the item? And what if for larger size categories, we use what would classify cargo or landmarks? So without further ado, here are the size categories we came up with. I'll start with the smallest to the largest. The first two aren't technically used in the game, but I jot them down in case you find uses for them. It's microscopic and speck-sized. Microscopic being, of course, anything so small that the player can't see, and speck-sized being anything is small enough to just be barely visible to the naked eye, no larger than a grain of sand. Honestly, this isn't really listed as a category in the book because I don't see many cases where the player interacts with that in Duppies and Gunmen specifically, but I wanted to include it here in case your game goes more granular. So the size listed in the books starts with a literal rule of thumb. Hence the name of the categorization system, the rule of thumb. So it starts with thumb-sized. From a pebble to a flower to most bugs really. A hummingbird, once it's closest to the size of your finger, or once it can fit on your finger, it would fall here. Next is hand-sized. So that's most rocks that you can pick up, rodents, a pigeon. Honestly, once you can still comfortably contain it in one hand, then toss it, then it fits within this category. And what I love about thumb and hand-sized as categories is that each person can picture their own hand or their own finger when visualizing a creature, for instance. But while the size may not be the same for everyone, my thumb is not going to be the same as your thumb or the thumb of every player in the room, but it wouldn't vary so much that it would upset the general narrative, because it's less likely that someone's thumb will be so big that it interrupts with the next size category or overlaps with a hand size category. And then next we have bucket size. So like cats, a chicken, a tiny bush, honestly, anything that falls to right about your knee, there is a wide range of what we expect buckets to look like, but that's okay because it still gives a general idea. And if it gets too small from that general idea, then it fits into hand size. If it gets too large from that general idea of what you expect for a bucket, then it falls into the next category, which is barrel sized. So a child, a goat, a dog, a bicycle maybe, a hedge. All sorts of things can fall into the category of able to maybe fit in a large garbage can. So whether the creature or object would fit in a bucket or barrel, or whether they weigh the same about as a full bucket or barrel, I'm hoping that these two categories, whether by dimension or weight, will be able to quantify in their minds the size of the thing being described. Next category is man-sized. This size classification just means it's the size of your average adult humanoid persons, but also creatures like ostrich or a donkey, dolphins, or maybe even objects like a motorbike or surfboard. I'm picturing from 5 to 7 feet as a fair amount of leeway before something would fall into the next category. Cattle-sized. Cows, horses, lions, tigers, bears, cars. Most of us have a general idea of walking up to something that big and being like, oh, okay, that's huge. I sort of think that long things like anaconda or crocodile would also fit into this category. I guess you can decide whether height or weight or a mix of both is the qualifying factor for some of these. But for cattle-sized, it's generally things that are one step above human. Now, the size classifications sometimes get harder once it's bigger than humans because the brain cuts off visualization. But I found a larger size that will help that visualization process, stepping it up from cattle size. And it wasn't easy finding a way to clearly differentiate that this is bigger than the other. In fact, you could say it was a mammuthian task. It's mammoth sized. The next size is mammoth size. So things like elephants, giraffes, buses, tall trees. I didn't want to use the term elephant size because I had recently created a stat block for elephants and I was kind of stuck for a while, knowing I needed to get a word to express its gargantuan size. So mammoths, a creature that has long been extinct, ended up biting the bullet. I'd be able to use the word mammoth size, and you can think of an elephant because, of course, and you also know it's bigger than cattle because, of course, a mammoth would be bigger than a cow. And if you think that elephants are cattle size, just check the size comparison on the internet because elephants they tower over rhinos and hippos, which tower over cows and horses. So rhinos and hippos would fall under mammoth size, and so would elephants and giraffes. So there's still a lot of variation in the size category, but all your brain needs to really know is it's bigger than me and it's bigger than the thing that is bigger than me. The next size category has even more variation, and you'll find that as we get up, the variation widens. Building size is the next category, and it covers trains, commercial airplanes, houses, skyscrapers, sperm whales, like the huge things. Honestly, anything this size, your brain has already sort of taken a perspective where physics, mathematician, if it's anything like mine at least. So all the players really need to understand that whatever is being described is big enough for them to walk on top of or inside of or just be engulfed in. So with this building size descriptor, from a house to a skyscraper, just the general idea that yes, this is large enough to enter. And then the final listed size category is mountain sized. So hills, mountains, villages, cities. Once you're this size, it means multiple buildings would be able to fit here. It's mostly to give the general idea that it's possible to stand on the thing and not see all of it. The size for anything at this point becomes more theoretical and there's way less need for specifics. A creature could move around and sprint or drive a vehicle on something of this size without reaching the end of it in a turn. So far, I haven't added any creatures of this size, but it's kind of nice to know that it exists if I need to. And I also use it to describe landscapes. And these are the ending of the listed size categories in the book, but there are also bigger sizes like planet size, which is anything so big it can be seen from space or from another planetary body, and cosmic, which the night sky or something the size of a whole universe. These are mostly for if you're doing a space adventure at this point or something that involves deities. Deities. All right, so that sums up the list. Here are the categories listed again, summarized in a table. And as I stated, default stats in my game are tied to the size categories for the creatures, but you can do your own thing and make it specific to your game. You might not even need to tie stats to it at all. This could just be a fun way to describe things for you. But what do you think? Does this size category listing fill your needs? Is it harder to use than any that you've seen in another game? Would you suggest any changes? Or is it just what you've been looking for? Let us know in the comments and like and subscribe if you want to see more. Bye.